Hamas's leader, Yahya Sinwar, has been killed by the IDF in Gaza. Sinwar was the architect of the 7th of October attacks against Israel and has been in hiding ever since. What does this killing mean for the conflict? Does it make a return of the hostages more likely? I'm Angus Colwell, Spectator's assistant online editor. To discuss all this, I'll be joined by Tom Gross, an expert and commentator on the Middle East. Tom, thanks for joining us on Spectator TV. What's the significance of Yahya Sinwar's death?
Well, I think it's very significant. If we could just put in context to remind people, Israel has also killed two other very major terrorists, as Israel would call them. The previous political head of Hamas was killed in Iran, that's Haniyeh, and then the head of Hezbollah was killed in Lebanon, that's Nasrallah. But in many ways, the death of Sinwar is even more significant. Sinwar was the architect of the October 7th massacres. He was the guy who was the most militant of the Hamas leaders. As long as he was in control, there was never really a chance to even discuss a better future for Gaza, for Palestinians, let alone a two-state solution. He was an absolute hardliner. He was also ruthless personally. He personally murdered people. I mean, other Palestinians also feared him. He once apparently strangled a Palestinian with a kafir, the Arab headscarf, in a cemetery in Khan Yunis in Gaza. He had previously been imprisoned for up to 23 years by Israel on 4 counts of murder. So for those of us who want a better future in the Middle East and for Gazans, I think this is probably a positive development.
What happens to Hamas now? You mentioned that Mohammed Deif was killed a couple of months ago. The political leader, Ismail Haniyeh, was assassinated in Iran. Who assumes leadership of the organisation now?
Well, no doubt they'll appoint someone, but I think it's the beginning of the end for Hamas. You know, a lot of people have said that Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's statement that he wants to end Hamas or wipe out Hamas for total victory was unrealistic because Hamas also represents an ideology, and that's correct. The ideology will still be there, but in effect, Hamas is broken. I mean, I don't want to compare Hamas to the Nazis because the Nazis were worse and it's a different situation. But let's say when Hitler died, there may have been for a short time some replacement head of the Nazi party. I don't know. There will no doubt be a replacement, but I don't think anyone has also the charisma, if that's what it is, or leadership abilities of Sinwar. I think this is the beginning of the end of Hamas. It's the beginning of the end of the current war in Gaza. No doubt the Hamas in exile, because they're based in Qatar and Iran, will elect a replacement. But how will that replacement even operate in a wartime situation? We know that Hamas already have trouble communicating with one another because of the war in Gaza. And I imagine after what happened in Lebanon to Nasrallah, the exploding pagers and walkie-talkies, Hamas are very reluctant to use electronic communications. So I don't know how a successor to Sinwar would even be able to, get a grip on the organization.
Can we talk for a little bit about some early reports of the killing? It's been understood that Yahya Sinwar has been underground in Gaza since the 7th of October. He's not been using any electronic communications. The early reports are that he was killed in a building at about ground level, not by special forces, not by the RAF, by a sort of regular IDF soldier. Can you tell us more about these reports, whether they seem likely, whether they seem ludicrous?
Well, I've seen images which seem accurate of a number of soldiers standing around a corpse which looks like Sinwar, and it's being reported that that was Sinwar's corpse. If that's the case, there are 6 or 7 soldiers in regular IDF uniform, and it seems like Israeli intelligence were not aware of Sinwar's exact location, and they sort of came across him in a firefight by accident. He was apparently wearing a belt or some clothing with grenades that did not go off on the body. I understand that he was killed a number of hours ago, and the Israeli authorities waited some time before they first gave some hints earlier today that Sinwar might be dead. I don't know whether it was underground. I imagine, because it's pretty horrible staying underground day and night without any light or fresh air, I imagine that unlike the hostages who are largely being kept underground in very bad conditions, Sinwar himself was confident enough to allow himself to come to ground level when he thought he wasn't going to get caught.
Sinwar was vehemently opposed to any kind of ceasefire deal with Israel about the return of the hostages. Does his death make the return of some hostages more likely?
Well, the families of the Israeli hostages have already released a statement calling on their Prime Minister Netanyahu to actually try and immediately do a hostage deal and basically have a unilateral ceasefire as part of that. I think there will be renewed pressure on the Israeli government to try and do a hostage deal, and if not end the war, at least start to bring it to an end. However, after the death of Haniyeh, the leader of Hamas in exile, to remind people he was based in Qatar, killed in Tehran in Iran, Sinwar was the new head of Hamas. So I'm not quite sure who would sign any such hostage deal or give the orders to release hostages. But one thing I've heard for some time is that Israel, through the Americans and the Qataris and the Egyptians, have offered the Hamas leadership to go into exile. When I say leadership, I mean leadership in Gaza, to leave Gaza, to be guaranteed safe passage, and to go to Algeria. Apparently, the government of Algeria has made a tentative agreement with Qatar, who would fund this, to accept possibly 3,000 or 4,000 Hamas fighters to be relocated there. And this is something that actually happened way back in the 1980s with Yasser Arafat and the PLO when they left Beirut and went to Tunisia. And Arafat indeed stayed in Tunisia before he eventually signed the Oslo Accords and returned to Ramallah in the West Bank. So I can imagine that we'll have a kind of situation where if Hamas feel broken, to save their own lives, the existing leadership inside Gaza may accept a deal like that, which I understand has already been on the table for months vis-a-vis Algeria and Qatar.
Okay, let's turn to the other front that Israel is fighting on, the war in the north against Lebanon. Does the killing of Yahya Sinwar mean that the effort in Gaza is properly wound down and that Israel may have more resources to devote to the northern front?
Well, yes, and I wouldn't he just say more resources? I mean, Hezbollah have always said that they will go on attacking Israel as long as there's a war going on in Gaza. So in a way, it gives Hezbollah a kind of excuse to do what Israel's asked, which is to withdraw from the border region between, where they were occupying right up to the northern border of Israel. And in fact, Hezbollah too are a kind of broken organization. Israel has hit them very hard in recent weeks. And I understand also that Hezbollah are looking for a way to climb down from the tree they've kind of climbed in confrontation with Israel to preserve themselves. Because of course, Hezbollah, although they're a kind of they call themselves the Lebanese resistance force. Maybe other Lebanese would see them as a kind of Iranian occupation force, but nevertheless, they are part of the Lebanese Shia population, an indigenous part of the population. So I think there'll be huge pressure on Hezbollah to agree terms that Israel would find acceptable, which is easier than in Gaza because Israel is not looking for any kind of territorial claims in South Lebanon. What Israel wants is Hezbollah forces to withdraw to north of the Litani River and to stop firing rockets at Israel. And I suspect that Israel will be satisfied with leaving Hezbollah in place so long as they agree to become a Lebanese political party rather than a kind of military force geared at Israel. And this, of course, will be excellent news for the state of Lebanon that can move forward if it doesn't have a kind of army within an army, which would be Hezbollah, occupying or controlling part of the country in a way that makes them more powerful than the Lebanese army, and has prevented Lebanon even having a president for almost 2 years, and is preventing, Lebanon's in a lot of internal strife economically and politically, and it will be much easier to resolve that, and for the Lebanese different political parties and ethnic groups to come together if Hezbollah would stop regarding itself as some kind of armed front against Israel.
Thank you very much. Final question, which I'm sure there's a very easy answer for. All-out war in the Middle East. About 2 weeks ago, Israel obviously came under quite a heavy attack from Iran, and there are some reports now that Israel have calibrated their response and they're ready to launch it. Today's news, are we any closer? Are we any further away from an all-out war in the region?
It's very difficult to say. Look, viewed from Israel and indeed from the Sunni Arab states, the real problem is not Iran, but it's the Islamic regime in Iran. And indeed, I have a lot of Iranian friends, and by the way, I'm often appearing on Iranian opposition radio and TV, and it's amazing the extent to which Iranians want Israel or the United States to accelerate the demise of the regime in Iran. So I'm not sure we'll have an all-out war, but certainly the government in Tehran is gravely weakened if two of their most powerful proxies, Hamas and Hezbollah, are themselves kind of neutralized. They still have the Houthis in Yemen, but yesterday the Americans hit the Houthis very hard with the bombing raid in Yemen. And it's very hard to say, but I certainly think this makes the likelihood of all-out war less rather than more.
Tom, thanks very much.